Affordability is a huge problem for U.S. patients. It affects whether a patient's going to fill their prescription in the first place and whether they'll stick with their prescribed treatments. Doctors know the costs are a big deal, but they generally have no way to understand the implications for the patient that's right in front of them. Hi, everyone. I'm David Williams, president of strategy consulting firm Health Business Group and host of the HealthBiz podcast, a weekly show where I interview top healthcare leaders about their lives and careers. My guest today is Kiser. He is CEO of Arrive Health, and he should have a lot to say about solving this problem of putting cost information right into the provider workflow. If you enjoy this episode, please press that like button and subscribe. Kyle, welcome to the HealthBiz podcast.
Glad to be here.
I love talking about costs in healthcare, especially about someone who's doing something about it. So that's going to be fun. I want to, before we get into that, ask you a little bit about your background and your upbringing. Any childhood influences that have still stuck with you, for example?
Oh, well, yeah. Well, I say I literally grew up in the employee benefits business. So my dad was in the employee benefits world. And so to the extent that when, if I got in trouble at school and got sent home, my punishment was stuffing enrollment packets. So I seen it from feet on the street and, always had a great interest in that world and wanted to go into that business. Honestly, that was the tunnel vision path that I was taking all the way through, high school and college. And as I started to work in that business, so early in my career, worked for, as a wholesale rep for employee benefits companies. It just, you start to see there are really good, well-meaning brokers out there trying to solve problems for their customers, but the options were so limited. You really could either shift the cost onto the back of the plan sponsor or shift the cost onto the back of the patient. And that was really the toolkit they had, to be perfectly honest. And so, that firsthand experience was what made me want to, be in sort of the innovation side of healthcare and see if there's, if there are actual real ways that you can start to influence and control lower cost.
Sometimes these career paths look clear in retrospect. In your case, it was it was pretty obvious up front. Now, I would say though that sometimes they say if someone's punished for something, they might not want to do it more. But it seems like I don't know if you get sent home from school every day and start your career early. But it's probably just the right amount, the right touch. So
I think there's maybe Thomas Merton said there's two paths to transformation. It's great love and great suffering. And so I think one of those two works every time.
When I was growing up, my dad is a highway safety researcher and used to come into the office and they used to take me into the film room and they'd tee up these films. And the ones that I remember the most were of these dummies. This is before it was sort of everybody was there and you'd see a film and it would show dummies being thrown around. The one I liked the best is when I think the Volkswagen Rabbit came out and they were showing the underride bars and how it's like a low car could go in and it'd shear off the head of the dummies, or they had actual pictures too. And I thought that was cool, but it didn't make me want to go into that. It didn't want to make me be a dummy, that's for sure. So you mentioned sort of you knew you wanted to do that early on, and then sort of education wise, like what did you study in school in order to get ready or for whatever other purpose?
I think that's that was by far not a straight line. I went to a small liberal arts school in Western North Carolina called Guilford College, which I love dearly. And, got a business degree, but I think, a business degree at a liberal arts Quaker school was a really unique and interesting thing. And it was, to me, less the subject matter and more the method was valuable. And it was, our economics test was 3 or 4 questions and the Wall Street Journal on your desk. And you had to write narratives about and apply the things you'd learned, which is a pretty high stakes environment when you get 3 or 4 questions that determine half your grade.
Yeah.
But a place that really encouraged critical thinking, really gave you a deep understanding of the human context. And then after all of that framework was set, then you can sort of gain some skill set. So I joke I could probably have benefited more from a peace and conflict studies degree from Guilford College than I would have a business degree, or equally, because it's more the place and the method and the people and the community. So I absolutely loved it. Still involved with them today.
I think I'm a
So
big fan of liberal arts education myself, and the idea is it's going to teach you how the critical thinking, as you mentioned, because even though the question of cost within healthcare was a big deal, even when you're growing up, I mean, the specific applications now and technology and the structure of the healthcare system are different. So if you'd studied that at the time, it wouldn't have been as helpful as just learning how to address these new and complicated challenges.
yeah, and people, right? Like a desire and sincere seeking of understanding others and their perspective, sort of that seek to understand as a skill set was something I really valued.
Talk about this, earlier part of your career before you got to what's now Arrive Health and was RX Review. Before I saw a few entities on your resume: BB&T, Assurance, Emeritus, Catapult, and ones that I noticed. What was that kind of progression like through those?
Yeah, so early career was doing, wholesale rep for employee benefits companies. So calling on brokers who would then work with employers, and you would get a little bit of interface there with the plan sponsors. In that case, so that was sales role in the belly of the beast, selling for payers of a variety, different varieties, sometimes ancillary benefits, sometimes others. What was really the turn for me is I went to work for Principal Financial Group, which was at the time they had a health plan and a wellness business, and so started to work in Principal Wellness Company. Had a great mentor there, and that was like a 50 person, maybe close to 70 person by the end, startup inside of a 10,000 person financial services company. And that's kind of where I got the bug to lean more heavily into the innovation side of healthcare. You just you see people that are so passionate about what they're doing and solving a big problem. And so maybe that entrepreneurship experience is what inspired the desire to then go be an early employee at WellTalk, early employee at Capital Health. Both led by really great folks. Got to learn from some great leaders and entrepreneurs at both of those stops, and those just gave me the bug to go earlier. And so, as you know, met Carm, and I think he was sitting at Galvanize working on the problem by himself at the time, and he started to assemble a team, a founding team that I was a part of, and we've been working on it ever since.
Great, and of course, you're talking about Carm Huntress, and the founders of RX Review, now Credo Health, and also a podcast guest. So when you came to RX Review, I mean, what was the early concept? Like what was the reason for this company being there? And obviously, it wasn't just kind of a Me Too players doing something new and unique.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is all inspired by Kevin O'Brien, who's one of the co-founders. He's a physician in Denver, and the initial spark for this company was because Kevin's mom approached him with a out of control monthly prescription spend and asked for some help. And so, like any good son with the skill set to do something about it, he looked at meds and said, "Well, this is a branded med that we could break into its generic parts. Here's a therapeutic equivalent for this one. You could pill split this one," and he cut her spend in half.
Yeah,
That was initially the inspiration for Kevin then to start doing that work on his own by himself inside of his clinic. So he aggregated this massive database of ways to save on medication, and that was the place from which we launched. And I think that set our course in a few really important ways. One is the provider centricity, that the right steward for this information is the provider. That's the one. Those are the folks that patients seek those answers from, and are often ill-equipped to answer those questions, not because they aren't skilled enough to do so, but because the information is not visible. And then two, just culturally, his experience with his mom was something that just sort of created the drumbeat for the culture. We still have a mantra that we developed years ago called "Lucy Up," and it's the reminder to the team to sort of look to the mission. When you get too far in the weeds, when you're working on something that may seem like a struggle or mundane, that we can tell each other to Lucy up, and we remember that this is about somebody we care about or ourselves that have had an experience with the system that just didn't make sense or was too expensive or couldn't access for one reason or another. And that's because Kevin's mom's name was Lucy. So even today we're still giving a monthly Lucy Up award. We've got a championship belt that gets passed around the country, and now there's sort of a fun phenomenon where people take the belt and do things like they'll go skiing with it. Or I think
yeah.
last month we had somebody go to the floor of the Indiana basketball arena with it. And it's a cool phenomenon that completely was a groundswell from the team. So,
Sounds good.
um,
So when you started with, so he started with something like specific problem solving for his mom, and then created more of a database, which should still be sort of like a list or best practices. How or when did you know that could be actually incorporated into a product?
I think that really where this took off is we started to work closely with UC Health in Denver and the Care Innovation Center and building some decision support applications that were in workflow. The goal of that was, can we take clinical best practice and cost, put it side by side into to a one-click experience for providers? And we did that successfully in some focused ways. And at the same time, real-time benefit was coming to be in the industry through the PBMs, and the PBMs were not experiencing um, great engagement with some of that information. And so we started to work with them on how we could improve engagement with real time benefit. And that's really where the thing took off, is that we, started to pull together. Now we've pulled together over 200 million health plan lives addressable on the supply side inventory of the network. We started to aggregate provider utilization through provider and EMR partnerships. We're now north of 300,000 users on that side of the network. And that was the moment where it started to click. We don't even do those decision support projects anymore, but it laid the groundwork and informed the way we develop product to really focus on user experience, to make things easier, not harder for providers, to have quality front and center in what we're putting forward, because this all comes down to provider trust, right? At the end of the day, if the provider trusts the tool, they'll use it. If they don't trust the tool, they won't, and we won't see the outcomes that we desire. At the same time, the patient has this inherent trust in their provider. They come back to them for those answers. And so we got to provide that information to them, arm them with the ability to serve their patients in that way. So it all, for us, on both sides of the provider relationship, both the tools they use and the patients they serve, this all comes down to providers' trust and belief in the data.
So if we think about what you were starting with, it sounded like some of the things like taking a branded product and splitting it into its generic equivalents, or having a pill that you could split. Those are things that are kind of more or less independent of an individual's benefit. In general, you could take a branded product, and if you can just separate it into components, that's one thing. But I think where it gets challenging beyond that is, as you're describing, how does it pertain specifically to an individual's benefit? Somebody could have a product in the first tier of their formulary, and another individual with the same health characteristics, different plan, it could be different. So the physician can't just depend on that. And it sounds like the real-time benefit is there is the information that's being provided, at least theoretically, to the prescriber that would help somebody understand, like, is this a tier one drug or not? Is that right? And can you say more about kind of what's
Yeah,
actually
even
being presented?
yeah, even beyond that. So, e-prescribing 1.0 provided exactly what you're describing. It was tier information and sort of some directional guidance that was at a group and plan level. Real-time benefit is patient-specific, moment in time specific, pharmacy-specific information. The reason that matters is prescribing 1.0 was 2004, maybe. And in 2004, they were starting to, the consumer-driven healthcare wave was just building. Today, that's the way of the world, right? Is that more than half of health plans are high deductible health plans. Patients are bearing first dollar risk on those things. And where a tier insight used to be good enough, it's not. And now
Yeah.
understanding exactly what the patient's facing from out of pocket perspective is just going to be a part of the way delivering great care is done.
So how do you mentioned the provider trust being important in the data and so on. How do you develop that trust? Because it's not a sort of a one-time, all at once kind of an approach. How do you actually look at that systematically?
It's largely the quality of the data we're presenting in workflow. So that takes a bunch of different forms. Some of that is the alternatives that are presented. So quantity issues with alternatives, or think about if you presented a 90-day alternative for an antibiotic or an opioid to a doctor, they'll never use that tool again, right?
Yeah.
They're going to go, this thing's broken. That's a bad recommendation. So we have to go to great lengths to make sure that any of those alternatives that we put forward are going to be clinically relevant and in context to the decision that's being made. Similarly, there's some like way in the weeds data exchange issues that are, EMRs and claim systems don't speak the same language as it relates to drug data. So we do a lot of translation between the two, and the problems in those translations are wildly variable based on provider or EMR. So it's actually a learning model that has to
Yeah.
continually update. It's those sorts of things that are, decidedly unsexy. I would love for those to be
Yeah.
like, I don't know, AI and blockchain driven, and there is some learning model aspects to it, but it's, these are just creating the good plumbing that so that we can put data forward that providers trust and they can use and that patients can benefit from. So that's foundationally provider trust. We also do a lot. Our whole, our client success and clinical programs team are more often than not clinicians, and they can have empathy for the folks that are using the tool. They can relate to those folks. They can help plug into the learning and development systems inside a health system so that the users are informed and can adopt the tools well.
Can you give an example of a sort of translation issue between an EMR and a claim system? Where would be the problem there? Can't they just say aspirin?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's not in the pill and capsule scenarios. It's in all the other non-standard drug forms. So something may come out of the EMR as a package size. Think about an inhaler, and it may need to go into the claim system as, you know, grams or milliliters or some specific measurement. And those things it has to be translated from one to the other to price appropriately, and it has to be translated back to deliver it into the EMR appropriately. And some of those things really matter. Those are the areas where there's a lot of cost, right? And that even what feel like somewhat innocuous things like inhaled steroids, albuterol comes in an inhaler and a disc and a nebulizer and all those different forms. A health plan's probably specified that one of those is $0 and all the rest of them are $250. And so,
Right.
from an out-of-pocket perspective, these things matter. Like, I don't know that anybody's going to change the world by being able to tell you the price of an antibiotic.
Yeah.
But in all these, derm and, oncology and these things where there are non-standard drug forms, that's where we've done the work to really start to put things forward that are reliable and trustworthy.
Got it. Let's talk about some of the things that have changed since you've been there. I mean, one thing is obviously your role. You're the CEO, and another thing is the name of the company was RX Review, and now Arrive Health. Can you talk about both of
Yep.
those transitions?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think from a naming perspective, we still do everything that we did as a core function as RX Review, a real-time benefit network, and connecting those things to the point of care is still true. I think what we see in the future and in our present are two things. One, it's not just about connecting the point of care; it's about connecting the care team and the patient into a tightly orchestrated data exchange that helps all of them make better decisions around that same event. One of the things we've done recently is we acquired a capability from UPMC that's a virtual pharmacy assistant. It automates care team outreach to patients and helps deal with adherence issues. So an example of where we're expanding some of the things we're doing that are just beyond what our core functions used to be. So Arrive Health is a way for us to have a bit of a broader brand to articulate some of those things as they expand. I think similarly, price transparency is not stopping with drugs, obviously, with all of the
Yeah.
legislation that we've had. And so I think we're positioning ourselves well for the future too, as those things start to expand.
And then what about your own role, Kyle? As you mentioned, you had been in the sort of the sales side before you came in to the company, and then now you've taken over the CEO role maybe a couple of years ago by now. What was the transition like doing that?
It was, I've been here for, year 9, so worked really closely with the team as we've grown it all throughout. And, was happy to step in when the board asked me to take this role. I think we were in a different stage and just needed, an opportunity to grow in a new way, and, happy to serve.
Talk about, you mentioned UPMC before. I think you have an investment from them as well. What's the relationship like there, and how's that impacting what you're doing on the product strategy? You mentioned the virtual assistant, for example.
Yeah, so UPMC is a longstanding customer of ours on the real-time benefit front. Always been a big supporter. We did at the end of last year. We acquired those capabilities and a team supporting those capabilities from them. They did invest alongside that. I mean, this is just a further extension of what our strategy has been, which is work closely with provider organizations that can, you know, be investors, be on the cap table, but also be sort of living laboratories for us. And, you know, we work really closely with those providers to make sure that those products meet all the criteria that I just described a little bit ago, you know, have a high bar for quality and trust. So, you know, future for us is a few things. I mean, one is that automated patient outreach and really starting to create the tools that make a health system experience around pharmacy feel a lot more like a digital experience that you have in every other aspect of your life. So how do we inform provider with real-time patient-specific cost at the moment of order? Patient walks out the door, they can engage via text message with a capability that can then help them have an affordability conversation with the technology, connect with the pharmacist if they need to. The goal is to start to automate as much of that process as possible around affordability and access.
So you've been quite successful in this space, and you have to cooperate with a lot of other players. There's other data suppliers that are in there as well. How do you differentiate yourself from competition? I think SureScripts also would at least, you know, claim to do something similar to what you're doing.
Yeah, a lot of it's around the quality aspects of what we're doing. So we've built, you know, we would claim that we've built the real-time benefit solution that's best positioned to serve specialty meds, as an example. We've got a lot of data to back that up. I think also just the provider centricity is an important way that we differentiate. That we are an organization that was incubated by a health system. We have a collection of health system investors that have resulted in, you know, products that are really attuned to the needs of both users and health system problems. So we think we're pretty differentiated in that category as well.
You mentioned in the name change, broadening from, you know, an RX, which you had in the name before, to Arrive, being broader. How much opportunity do you think there is beyond the pharmacy? If we talk about pharmacy, including specialty products, is that just the tip of the iceberg? Is it, you know, 50%? Or is it really the dominant part, and these other elements are kind of minor in comparison?
Well, I think the first step on that path is to specialty meds that are on the medical benefit, right? You know, 50% of prescription spend is specialty drugs now, representing 2% of prescriptions. So in a lot of cases, those are medical benefit or administered drugs that just require different solutions. So we're actively expanding into that area to make sure we can serve that. I think the natural continuation of that work will be that this expands beyond that into other medical benefit areas. That's a much more complicated world, as you know, just because, you know, the procedures that are going to planned to happen on the way in the door are not always the procedures that happen when she walks out of the door. So that is an emerging area that we'll be really well positioned to support, but I don't know that that's exactly the focus of the company right now. Right now, it's about how do we best serve specialty meds, affordability, onboarding, and access, and that's where I think we've got the biggest opportunity in the near term.
Great. So, you know, there's a lot of dark things happening, and probably in the economy and the world, and, you know, hospitals are struggling. You mentioned your health system focus to start with. As you look ahead, are you optimistic, pessimistic? How are you looking at the world?
The world generally, or healthcare?
Well, as it relates to for the world, I won't. If you're positive on the world, that'd be a different story. But for healthcare, and as I think specifically as it relates to what you're doing, is it sort of tailwinds to it, or, you know, you think you'll run into more of a headwind?
I think there's nothing but opportunity ahead of us. I think the way that we position the company and our value proposition is going to change as a result of the environment that our customers reside within. You know, health systems, we need to be focused on how do we support their own financial health, and that might be through automation, that might be through helping drive revenue for them. That's an important part of our value story going forward. But overall, that's the how on what is at its core serving patients around affordability. I think the opportunity for health systems is that largely health systems are on defense as it relates to price transparency, and I think in the world of drug, there's a huge opportunity for health systems to be on offense. Like I mentioned earlier, that's where patients go for those answers first. And now the tools exist to deliver some of those answers in real time. And by doing so, the health system has a better opportunity to serve that patient as a pharmacy customer, in a risk environment, you know, all of the things that generate revenue for them now. So I really think that specifically price transparency as it relates to medications is a great opportunity for the health systems to sort of go on offense as it relates to price transparency.
Sounds good. So my final question for you is whether you have had a chance to do any reading, if there's any good books you've read lately that you would, or another time that you would like to recommend to the listeners.
Oh, geez. Good books lately. Actually, the one of the best books I've read lately is a book called See No Stranger. And I think the author's name was Valerie Kaur.
Okay.
And it was fascinating. It was awesome. And I tend to read a bunch of, weird contemplative stuff from a bunch of different areas. Richard Rohr and those types of folks, Sufi poetry. This is definitely in that vein, but it's sort of how do we approach the world as a intent to understand others and a curiosity and a sincere hope to understand them better. And just that simple reframe can create some pretty powerful and meaningful change in the world. So, See No Stranger. That's the one I would read.
Check it out. Well, if we needed to underline your liberal arts credentials, we've just done so. It's definitely not a business book. Well, Kyle, I want to say thank you, Kyle Kiser, CEO of Arrive Health, for joining me today on the HealthBiz podcast, talking about costs, transparency, and what to do about it all. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to the HealthBiz podcast with me, David Williams, president of Health Business Group. I conduct in-depth interviews with leaders in healthcare business and policy. If you like what you hear, go ahead and subscribe on your favorite service. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe on your second and third favorite services as well. There's more good stuff to come, and you won't want to miss an episode. If your organization is seeking strategy consulting services in healthcare, check out our website, healthbusinessgroup.com.